Sandbox Cooperative. Woo! Here at Sandbox Cooperative, we're looking to knock down walls with curiosity and conversation. No matter where you are on your faith life spectrum, we're glad you're here. So thank you for showing up if you're here in our live audience or if you're here online. So today we are welcoming Professor Drew Hart, and you'll hear more about him in a little bit here. Don't forget, I want to just mention right away, don't forget to check out the Sandbox Cooperative podcasts that are online. They continue to curate conversation around life, faith, and curiosity. It runs twice a month and is available through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Sandbox Cooperative is a resource that is completely supported through donations and grants and financial gifts. So if you'd like to support us in developing this resource, you can make a financial gift by hitting the Donate tab on the website. And finally, a quick word about our format tonight. First, we'll hear from Professor Drew Hart, and then there will be some time for Q&A, both from the live audience and from the online audience. So for more about those online offerings, we're going to go over to Chris.
All right, so if you're viewing online, ask questions, join conversation, use either the hashtag Sandbox Co-op through Facebook or Twitter, or if you're in the comment section, just leave something there. Any questions that we get, we're going to try to get to and ask Drew as we go through the night. We'd love to also know where you're watching from, so maybe use that same hashtag and let us know how many you're watching with and where you're at. Engage with each other, keep the conversation going throughout the evening, and we'd love to keep hearing from you. And also, just hear from you after the event's done. Keep that hashtag rolling, and let's keep talking about this when the event is through. So, with that, here's Dave.
Hey, how is everybody doing tonight? Good. So good to have everybody here, and it's so good. It's my honor, it's my privilege to be able to introduce Professor Drew Hart. Drew comes to us all the way from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He's a theologian, he's an activist, he's a blogger, he's the author of The Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. The book happens to look like this. We have a stack of them over there for our in-house guests. Buy them, and buy lots of them. Buy one for yourself, share with a friend. Go on Amazon.com, buy some more. It's all there, and I highly recommend it for anybody who is looking to dive deeper into the conversation that we have tonight. Professor Drew is at Messiah College in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. His blog is hosted by Christian Century. He speaks regularly at churches, universities, and seminaries around the country, and this is his first time joining us in the Sandbox. So with that, let's welcome Professor Drew Hart.
Good evening. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be in Rochester and to be having conversations around race and racism. Sometimes when we have these kind of conversations, I'm always curious if people are going to show up, because these are the kind of conversations where people sometimes avoid at all costs. And so grateful that you all are here and to have conversations around race and racism. And particularly for us to be thinking about it, I like to think about the church and its own engagement on these subjects and expanding its own understandings and frameworks of what we mean when we even talk about race and racism. And so that's what I hope we can spend a little time doing today. So I periodically get a lot of requests to meet with local faith leaders in my own area. Many times pastors want to pick my brain and ask me questions and kind of process things. And so I can't always do all of them, but every now and then I try my best to kind of connect with folks when I'm able to. And so on one particular occasion, this was a few years back, even before I wrote my book, pastor, he was a white, 30-something pastor, kind of a younger, trendy church, and they were kind of growing fast. And he reached out to me and wanted to have a conversation and get to know me better and share stories. So we met halfway. It was a summer and hot day, and we met at a McDonald's in the middle of the afternoon. And so there we were, and we're swapping stories and sharing our experiences, and we're drinking sweet teas from McDonald's, if y'all know the $1 sweet teas. I always joke, so I'm from the north, but but I always joke about like loving Southern sweet tea, and you know you're having like the real stuff when the sugar's gritting through your teeth, right? You got a cavity while you're drinking, and then you know you've really enjoyed yourself. And so that's what's going on. We both had sweet teas, and we're kind of just sharing stories, and we had a lot of folks that we didn't even realize that we had in common between each other in terms of friends and acquaintances. And so it was just a good time. And also just sharing some of our life experiences, right? Some of them similar and some of them very different than one another. And as we went and as we talked, we just shared and kind of grew in an understanding. And then partway through, my friend there, he grabs one of these sweet tea cups and he puts it between us. And he's like, Drew. Kind of having like a little serious moment. Drew, you see this cup? You see on one side of the cup, there's a logo, and on the other side of the cup, there's some writings, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and so I need your eyes to see my side, to see on your side of the cup, and you need my eyes to see on my side of the cup, and so we're kind of having like this nice little PBS moment, right? It's kind of nice, And so I was like, oh, that's really kind. He's kind of talking about how we need to share and swap stories, kind of like what we were doing. So after he was done, I said, that was really nice, but life doesn't actually work like that. We all should be sharing stories, but that's not going to solve racism. And to be honest, I already know what's on your side of the cup. That's what I told him. And then I explained what I meant. I said, look, when it comes to race, I grew up, even in all black neighborhoods, I had mostly white teachers. I had to learn about Eurocentric history and art and literature. As I went off to college, I was the only young black male on my floor. I had to navigate all the kind of different cultures and worlds that were going on. Even the work that I do today as a professor and speaker, I couldn't do what I do without understanding and having processed what white people are thinking sometimes as they're staring at me, speaking to them, right? And so I got to make sense of these things. And so I've often had to navigate these white dominant cultural spaces throughout my entire life. I've had to learn these things. And I said, because my friend, he was an InterVarsity Press author, doing well, travels around himself some. And I was like, look, you can never step foot in the black community. You could go your whole life not know anything about black intellectual thought, art, literature, trends, music, culture, any of that stuff, and you're going to be just fine. You can just stay bubbled off in white dominant cultural space, peers, networks, all of that, and that's not going to change or impact your life at all, right? In terms of him being able to do what he does. And so what I wanted to help him see at that point was that race isn't just a cultural exchange program, right? Solving race is more than just a cultural exchange program, because if we just think of it in those terms, we're not being honest and we're not paying attention to the power dynamics that lay behind all these things, so that what history and art and literature gets taught in school and all those things have huge histories and power dynamics that we've got to unpack and pay attention to if we're going to be honest about trying to solve these problems. And so as good, as well-intended as he was in terms of his idea of, just sharing stories and we needing each other, it's just dishonest that in many ways it's much more complex, and we have to pay attention to how race actually functions in our society, and we have to have a better framework of how that actually impacts our everyday lives. And so that's hopefully some of what we can spend a little bit of time doing today. So I always like to bring really deep thinking philosophers into the conversation, so I figured we'd start with Chris Rock. So Chris Rock, he has this quote. I'll just read it. He says, this is about reframing conversations on race. He says this: so to say Obama is progress is saying that he's the first black person that is qualified to be president. That's not black progress, that's white progress. There's been black people qualified to be president for hundreds of years. The question is, my kids are smart, educated, beautiful, polite children. There have been smart, educated, beautiful, polite black children for hundreds of years. The advantage that my children have is that my children are encountering the nicest white people that America has ever produced. Let's hope America keeps producing nicer white people. His point, though, right, is sometimes we think that progress, especially when we're talking about racial progress, is really about black people improving themselves and people of color broadly improving their lives and stuff. But what we're not paying attention to is that we live in a society that has 400 years of white people controlling and dominating this society, organizing the society, and therefore deeply shaping the lived experiences of people of color in our society as well. And so the difference between what my kids are growing up in and what kids grew up in 1850 only has to do, for the most part, has more to do with how white people are organizing society than it does with their own gifts, talents, and pursuits and dreams. So in the 1940s, there was something called the Clark-Doll experiments. Anybody familiar with the Clark-Doll experiments? A couple people are. Often taught, especially in psychology classes, you'll hear about the Clark-Doll experiments. Pretty popular during the civil rights movement. They kind of looked at that to help kind of argue for the desegregation of schools. What was interesting about the Clark-Doll experiments is that they would take one child at a time, in this case only black and white, but they would sit them down one at a time and have a white doll and a black doll, and they'd ask them a series of questions. Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And so they ask these questions to kind of process and make sense of the answers that were given. Most people were not surprised by what these white children were saying in the 1940s at that particular time. It's not, we don't remember and pay attention to that particular study because of the white children's answers. We probably can all guess what they said, right? That everything white was good, everything black was bad, right? And so there was this kind of racial hierarchy that they had internalized because of the society that they lived in which they saw whiteness as positive and good, and blackness as bad and negative, right? And so we're not shocked by that per se. Why people were more interested in that study was the black children and their responses. Now, oftentimes the framework that people think of is, reverse racism. That's the real problem that we got to respond to. But what they found was something very different than reverse racism. They asked them the same questions. Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the beautiful doll? And the black children, many of them had internalized the same racial hierarchy, right? So when they asked them which doll is the ugly doll, and they pointed to the black doll. And when they asked them which one is the good doll, they point to the white doll, right? And after all these questions were given, and then they'd ask them, which doll looks most like you? And after they've given all these negative answers about the black doll, they point to the black doll, right? These dolls look just the same other than the color of their skin, right? And so they had internalized a racial hierarchy in which whiteness was also for them positive and good and everything right in the world, and blackness was also negative. And so one of the things that's important for us to think about when we're talking about race is that we're not just talking neutrally about just racial prejudice in and of itself. There's a particular historical way in which race developed in our country that made particular justifications and arguments that shaped the way that all of us as human beings perceive and see the world, right? It's about seeing and being seen in the world. And so to be human in a society with 400 years of white supremacy shaping its life is going to impact everybody, right? And so we have to pay attention then not only to just the idea of race, but that within the idea of race itself, there's a particular ideology or worldview or framework of racial hierarchy that imagines and helps, it gives us a lens in which we all see whiteness as positive, and there's I guess you could say a laddering, right? Of coloration, so that in any community, almost globally, right, you can go and you can see that the lighter you are, the more positive it's seen, and the darker you are, the negative. And you can see that on every single continent in our country, and a persistent anti-blackness, especially within that's global as well. So if we're going to have really meaningful conversations on race and racism, one of the things that we have to do is just begin to clarify what we even mean when we use particular words, particularly racism. It's such a hot word, right? People get very defensive. You say something is racist, and people get very defensive, and it sometimes shuts down conversations. And oftentimes, people don't even mean the exact same thing when they say racism. Oftentimes, we're meaning different things. And so what I found is that there's at least two main definitions that are kind of floating around and sometimes we're just miscommunicating in terms of what we actually mean when we say racism. So on one hand, I'd say that there's what I call the thin definition, which is what we see, I would call it the English dictionary definition of racism, right? And what I mean by that is the first definition that you might find often in an English dictionary, which is, personal prejudice or hatred from one person, individual, to another individual, right? And so that's kind of what I think a lot of people mean when they talk about race and racism. They're talking about personal prejudice from one individual to another individual. That's one way of talking about it, and I think that's the most common way that most people think about what racism means for them. But if you were to go, let's say, to a sociology department, particularly those who study in the field of critical race theory, right, you're going to have a much more thicker, robust definition of racism that's not just so focused on individuals, right? And so in the sociological definition, this thicker definition, is looking not at individuals, right, not at matters of the heart that nobody can see and understand. They're looking at widespread patterns, right, all throughout society. They're looking at how racism is a way that it actually organizes our society and structures our lives. They're looking at the widespread patterns throughout our society. They're looking at how our lived experiences are being shaped by all these things. They're looking at the history for why racism developed in the first place. What was its function? What social and political work was it doing, right? And so just a much broader, thicker framework. And I think when we can move from a thin definition to a thicker definition, we actually begin to understand, and things actually make much more sense in terms of what's going on around us. But if we focus solely on thin definitions, who knows what's going on in somebody else's heart, right? That's none of us know that other than the person themselves, and that almost distracts and misses the point, right? When we can't actually see the bigger picture of what's happening all around us in society. And so I think for us to be aware, number one, that sometimes people are meaning very different things. One is individual prejudice, and the other one is systems and structures and how our society is impacted and organized by race in a broader scale. And those are two different ways of thinking about race and racism. So this is my own little makeup working definition. I'm always tweaking it a little bit, but I'll read it real quick just to give you an idea of a thicker definition. So racism is a humanly constructed system, right? We made it up, that socializes people into their racial identities, biases, and practices, and it organizes our society by race, whether legally or de facto, in a way that structurally justifies advantaging whiteness as a marker for social access and dominance. It explicitly and implicitly distorts people's perceptions and social frameworks so that they view white bodies, practices, cultural productions, traditions, and knowledges as normative, universal, superior, and more valuable than non-white ones, right? And so that's a thicker definition of race and racism that actually explains what's going on broadly in our society and not just trying to guess what's happening in somebody's heart. These are things that are actually measurable, that sociologists can show that this is happening, right? And I think that that's a more helpful way of starting our conversations around racism than often where we are at. There was a book that in the early 21st century that talked about a racialized society from a Christian standpoint, and I'll just note a couple things that they mentioned. They said that a racialized society is one in which intermarriage rates are low, residential separation and socioeconomic inequality are the norm, our definitions of personal identity and our choice of intimate associations reveal racial distinctiveness, and watch this, where we are never unaware of the race of a person with whom we interact. In short, and this is its unchanging essence, a racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. And so we get this kind of broad sense in which a racialized society impacts all these different areas of our lives. And sometimes, again, it's helping us see the bigger picture of our racialized society and not just merely trying to think again about the individual hearts and personal prejudice, which in some ways, I would argue, everybody has prejudice, right? That's a human phenomenon that we all participate in. But to what degree are we unaware and participating in race and how it organizes our society on a large scale and the widespread patterns that shape our lives. And in that sense, I'm just caught up in these historical forces and unaware that we're kind of being puppeted along, thinking that we're kind of free agents. So if we're going to move from a thin definition to a thicker definition, then it also forces us to kind of reflect on some of the ways that we talk about race and racism. I know as somebody that does the work of actually engaging, having these conversations quite a bit, it's not strange for me sometimes to hear somebody say, stop playing the race card, right? Stop playing the race card, and what they mean by that, of course, is that if you interject and talk about race into this particular moment, they're suggesting that it's inappropriately being brought up, and so you're playing a race card. And so I often thought, well, sometimes it's worth, discarding somebody's, analogy, and other times it's worth jumping in and exploring that idea even further, right? And so I figured with this race card idea, let's jump in further with this idea. And so, one of the things that was kind of frustrating was that usually it was brought up, if, let's say, somebody was shot by the police, a young black man was killed by the police, and the black community is upset, and they're saying that, this is wrong, right? There's racial injustice going on, and it needs to stop. And then somebody might say, stop playing the race card. And for me, the irony is that oftentimes many white people, not all, but many white people are kind of responding to that one solo incident. Well, I think oftentimes black communities and other people of color as well there's a lot more historical memory and a lot more awareness of the widespread patterns that are going on in society, right? So I kind of liken it to a deck of cards, right? If you had a deck of cards and you laid them all out and you looked at them carefully, you'd see that there's some patterns going on, right? You're going to see 4 aces, 4 kings, 4 queens, 4 jacks, all that stuff. You kind of make sense of all the different things that are going on. And so you lay it out, you kind of have a big picture of how they all fit together. You can kind of put them back in place, and the kind of order and how they're patterned together. And then you could take any individual card and how they fit into the larger whole, right? It's just kind of a wide-scale pattern. And I feel like oftentimes in the black community, that's often what we see happening, right? Is that most black people are not merely just saying, oh, that was a racist moment in and of itself in isolation. There's some historical memory, right, that goes back several generations, right, about what has gone on with what their parents have seen, what their grandparents have seen, what their great-grandparents have seen. And not only that, but what's going on in one's own community, right? So if I've seen, not only my brothers get harassed and bullied by police, but my friends and my neighbors and all that stuff, it's going widespread all throughout my community. That's going to inform how I see any one individual event, right? And so often what I find is that often it's many white people are playing a race card, individual, and we're saying, no, we need to analyze the whole deck because the whole deck is racialized and we see that it's stacked against us, right? And so I think that is a broader framework of seeing much more wide scale what's going on in our society and not just looking at it from an individual standpoint. I remember a few years ago, Paula Deen said some terrible things. She kind of was just all over on the news. Everyone kind of highlighted what she had said. And I remember that it was intriguing to me just watching what was going on because it seemed like everybody kind of was like, oh, that's just terrible, right? It was almost like in uniform, all Americans just kind of wagged their finger at Paula Deen, like bad Paula Deen, right? Bad Paula Deen. And at first, I wanted to kind of get into it too, right? Yeah, bad Paula Deen, how terrible, because it was some really ugly things that she said. But then I stepped back, I was like, wait a minute, what's going on, right? It's so easy, all of a sudden, everybody wants to scapegoat racism onto Paula Deen as though she was in some lab somewhere and created it by herself, right? She did not create racism. She wasn't some mad scientist that cooked this up for us, right? No, She is a product of communities and history, societies that shaped her. You only can understand Paula Deen in light of American society and history as a whole, right? She didn't plop down out of nowhere, out of a vacuum with these ideas. She was socialized into these ideas, right? And so it's so easy to just isolate and put it onto one individual, a bad Paula Deen, and not take ownership of the fact that we all participate in American society. Now, we're not all necessarily saying those particular things, but we're all participating in society, and so we all have some complicity in what's going on around us, and oftentimes, many of us are not actively resisting these forces. We're either just kind of quietly going along or sometimes actively perpetuating it, right? But nonetheless, all of us have to, it's too easy to kind of have this cultural reflex where we just kind of scapegoat this one individual person, and then we can kind of feel really good about ourselves. Look at all those bad racists, right? The bad racists, and then there's us good people, right? And I think that's too clean. It's not messy enough. It's not honest enough about the ways that all of us participate in society in very real ways. And so while, yes, it is terrible what Paula Deen said, and I sure hope that that's not stuff that any of us will be perpetuating, but our hands aren't clean yet, right? And so how do we move from just that kind of, again, thin framework to really living lives that are anti-racist and actually resisting these social phenomenons that are going on in our society, and acknowledging that even when we do that, we're still a part of this society anyway. So one of the challenges for combating, racism in our society today and being honest about it is that there's this tendency to fall into colorblind ideology. Right? Colorblind ideology is basically saying, I don't see color, right? Maybe some people here didn't realize I'm a black man that's standing up here in the front, but some people apparently they claim that they don't see color, right? They don't recognize it. I'm just American. I just see America, right? Or we all bleed red. That's all I know. Or I'm Christian, so that's all I don't see anything else, right? And they all sound really nice, but it's fairly dishonest, right? Of course they see color. What are they talking about? And the problem isn't seeing difference, right? The diversity of our skin tones and all that thing, that's not the problem that we need to deal with. The problem is the racism, right? The way that we've organized our lives and the way that it benefits some and harms others, right? That's what we need to be paying attention to. And so often I say, it's not race that you're blind to, right? It's that you're not seeing racism, right? That's what people are missing and not seeing how it's shaping our lives all around them. But the irony of colorblind ideology is that many sociologists have found that many people who espouse colorblind ideology in many ways are actually living extremely racially distinct lives, right? So there's this kind of hypocrisy going on that people aren't even aware of in their own lives. So even with good intentions, right? I'm colorblind, I don't see color, and then all their social networks are white. They go to church, white in white neighborhoods. They send their kids to all white schools, go to, where they shop, everything, right? Even down to you look at someone's bookshelves, and most people in America, their bookshelves are racially distinct based on their own racial demographic group, right? And so in big ways and in very little ways, all of a sudden we can begin to see how racially distinct our lives actually are, and that all of us, probably much more than we would like to admit, are participating in racialized societies, right? In these racialized patterns. In some ways you could say our lives are racially managed without us even having realized it, that all of a sudden we wake up one day and race has deeply shaped and stained our lives in really meaningful ways that we need to begin to acknowledge. And so aside from the fact that this kind of colorblind ideology is just not true, and it's not helpful, and it's not honoring of the diversity that exists, but it's also we're lying to ourselves, and we're not able then to actually begin to live differently even in our own lives if we're going to be so stuck on this idea that we can't see race and racism. And so I think we've seen that is one of the huge barriers in even having real meaningful conversations around race and racism in our society today, is this denial of one's own participation in our racialized society. So I I went to Messiah College, and then afterwards, for 4 years, I was a youth pastor and also worked at an after-school program there in the city. And there was a particular neighborhood I lived in called Allison Hill, which is a mostly poor black and brown community. And for the most part, there's some white people that live there, but not a lot of white people. And especially when you get into like the heart of Allison Hill, like there's very few white people. White people don't even like driving through Allison Hill. And so usually the only white people that you see in that neighborhood are like very poor white people. This neighborhood was once at one time white and had changed over. And so they're kind of like the white people that could not get out. So one particular day, I hopped into my little 92 Mercury Sable as my first car. You know, your first love, you love your first car. So driving in my Mercury Sable, and I'm kind of going through the heart of Allison Hill on Market Street and towards 14th, like it's a really poor neighborhood right there. Again, where you usually don't see many white people at all. And this particular day, I see like a whole bunch of white people. I'm like, what in the world is going on? You know, like there's just a huge mass of white people. And I noticed like really quickly, like they all got like these really yellow shirts on. They want to be seen, and they're doing a good job at it. Everyone is seeing them. They got this flatbed truck, and they're handing out groceries to everybody that's going on. I almost stopped to just get me a grocery bag, because it seemed like they're just indiscriminately giving it to everybody, you know, like you get a bag, you get a bag, everybody, you know, everybody gets a bag, right? Look under your chair, right? And so there I am, kind of looking and kind of thinking like, oh, it's probably just silly church folk that we just don't do things very wise, you know, not the best way of distributing resources, but whatever, you know. But then I get a little closer, and then all of a sudden things weren't funny anymore, because then I saw what was on their shirt, and I saw that it said Harrisburg Invasion. Harrisburg Invasion. They were going to invade our neighborhood, right? Like normally you think, you know, this kind of like savior complex, you know that it happens, right? That people have these kind of savior complexes, but usually you don't like put that as like the motto. But there they thought that poor black and brown folk were just helplessly waiting around for them to kind of show up and do their drive-by ministry, right? For 24 hours and then be gone again. And it's, you know, I often think like, you know, what might have happened had they been willing to kind of not see themselves as in kind of like a hierarchical position where they had everything to give and nothing to gain, right? What might have happened had they switched positions where they became followers of leaders that were already existed in that neighborhood that were doing great work in that community. Just amazing stuff back then and still today. Amazing stuff that they could have come alongside of. Maybe they might have said, we don't need your money, we don't need your groceries, but we need some folks to serve and to be mentors for our program, right? I don't know, who knows what would have happened, but the opportunity never came because they never reached out to local leadership. They kind of did their drive-by ministry, they showed up, and then they were gone again. And of course, like, I always have to check myself and say, like, look, these folks had good intentions. These are not like, you know, this is not 1850, they're not coming in here enslaving people. This is not 1950, they're not lynching people, not trying to set up a segregation system. These folks had good intentions. They wanted to do good. I'm confident that their intentions were really good, right? And yet, the crazy thing is that in all of those good intentions, the racial hierarchy still existed, right? It never got subverted. So even in that, they still saw themselves and interacted with this black and brown community in a position of hierarchy. And I think it helps us realize that our good intentions aren't good enough if we're not going to get to the root of things, right? To get to the real root of things and subvert the racial hierarchy itself. Because so long as the racial hierarchy exists, then we're not really solving the problem of racism, right? And so good intentions can just as easily perpetuate these hierarchies that exist in our society. So I just want to kind of end with this thought around Romans 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, I exhort you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a sacrifice, alive, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this present world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may test and approve what is the will of God, what is good and well-pleasing and perfect. And I want us to think about the idea that, this idea of nonconformity and transformation as it relates to two areas of our lives, both our minds, that we have renewed minds, but also then transformed in terms of our embodiments, right? That we need to have new ways, because race, it shapes our perceptions of how we know and see and are seen in the world, right? It presents a lens and a framework over our eyes and our minds that need to be renewed. We need new ways of seeing one another and thinking, new frameworks that aren't tainted and distorted by the ones that we're just kind of socialized into. But then just more than that, though, we have to take seriously our embodiments in the world. We actually have to think that what we do with our bodies actually matter, right? That where we place our bodies, who we place our bodies alongside of, what spaces our bodies go into and what spaces our bodies do not go into. All of those things actually matter, right? That when people are gathering and speaking and addressing issues, is our body on the couch or are we showing up, right? All of those things, our actual embodiment in the world and what we do with our bodies, where we place our bodies and whose bodies we place our bodies alongside of, all of those things actually matter. And especially as the church, if we're going to be transformed and non-conforming in the world, given these racialized patterns that are pervasive, right? And we could have spent all kinds of time looking at actual stats, right? If we're going to be nonconformists in that kind of world, this racialized world that we live in, then we need to have renewed minds and also have a new kind of embodiment that is transformed in the world. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Drew. If you are in the room, I know we've got a couple of mics that are going to go around. If you're watching us online, again, let us know what questions you've got or what comments you have through the chat boxes wherever you're watching, and we'll get those questions over to Drew. So I'll hand it back to you guys.
Thank you so much, Drew, for your presentation. Again, wow. And you were the one doing all the talking. Again, we'd love to hear just questions that come up from the studio audience. If you're interested in having a question, feel free to raise your hand. We'll get you as soon as we can. As Chris said, online, talk amongst yourselves. Have conversations in the comments, in-house as we go. Part of this dialogue is really about respect and how we respect. It requires some respect and some trust of each other. And sometimes the language we choose is even well-intentioned, may not be quite right, but with a little bit of grace and trust in each other, we're going to do our very best, and we might just learn something while we're at it. So with all of that said, Drew, as you were talking, and as I read your book as well, it got me thinking about where we've been this week. I want to just talk about a couple things that took place this week, and not in the last month or even the last year. This last week, the cops in the Elton Sterling killing in Baton Rouge, we found out that they wouldn't be charged. Locally, our St. Olaf College, they shut down because of racist messages that were sent to black students. President of the United States was wondering why the Civil War happened. Adam Jones, outfielder for the Orioles, was getting racist taunts from the fans in Boston. So I'm really glad that we live in a post-racial America. But it's all to your point, right? That no matter what race or identity you land in, it's in relationship to white supremacy. And I was just wondering if you'd say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's helpful even to piggyback off of those examples. Like, those are the things that kind of help wake us up to what's going on. But race and racism are still happening even outside of these terrible moments, right? In the mundane, everyday lives and decisions and choices that we make, racism is at play. So it's not even just these horrible things that sicken us or sometimes get our attention, but it's actually our everyday, boring lives that racism is still happening. And I think for us to even see that is important. But yeah, it is under this umbrella of white supremacy, right? And sometimes that's a scary word. So sometimes, we hear that and we think neo-Nazis and KKK and all these bad people, right? The alt-right or whatever that means, right? That's what white supremacy is all about. But white supremacy is really all it is when I talk about racial hierarchy, that's what we're talking about. That's white supremacy, right? It's this hierarchy, this laddering that distorts our vision and shapes all of our everyday interactions, right? In ways that sometimes is obvious, things that, these incidents that happen, and other times in ways that we're not aware of because we're so socialized by the society that's shaped by, again, 400 years of white supremacy. We're so shaped by it that we don't realize how strange and awkward some of our lives are, right? We don't realize that there's just something terribly wrong about our everyday ways of being and living and relating to one another in the world. And so until we can kind of see that is this big umbrella that shapes our lives and patterns, our decisions, whether we're aware of it or not, we're not really going to begin to solve, really get to the root of racism.
It's, but that was just as a learning that, whether no matter where you identify that I'm as shaped by white supremacy as anybody from any other background.
Right, we're all internalizing it. Because and that's the thing, like, it's actually, the point is that we're all human beings, right? And so because we live in a society that's been organized and shaped and influenced by white supremacy for so long, like, we're all susceptible to internalizing it. None of us are outside of that. And so it may come out in different ways, and certainly certain communities have been much more aware of that problem and have tried to create traditions and customs to resist it. Sure. But nonetheless, we're all human beings and susceptible to internalizing it.
Yeah. As we get started here, and I know that there's going to be lots of questions, you talk in different venues and different places around the country. I think you were out in Denver recently, I saw, but what is one question that when you present, people always seem to ask? And what is a question that they don't ask, but you wish that they would?
Question that is always asked. That's a...
like you can see it coming a mile away, and it's going to be asked.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of them. It's hard to narrow down which one. There's like a range of questions. I mean, so this might sound, we're live, aren't we? I'm going to say it anyway. But it's, but I mean, so I'll speak broadly, then maybe I'll think of a good specific one. But like broadly, like oftentimes, when I have experienced many white people get defensive to what I've been saying, and they have like a retort, usually it's something that I've heard a lot, right? And so it's not necessarily like they think it's like, it's almost like the, stop playing the race card, right? Or race baiters and all this kind of language that's kind of created, and that in many ways it's set up to kind of scapegoat and ostracize the person that's pointing out racism, right? That they're the ones causing all the trouble, right? Kind of like Martin Luther King when he shows up in Birmingham, right? They called him an outside agitator, literally, and said, our Negroes were just fine until you showed up and started stirring up all this trouble, right? And so I think that can be very frustrating. But more specifically, in terms of recently, I think that an example, when people talk about the anti-black violence that's going on in our society today, almost always you will either hear, what about the black on black violence, or you'll hear, all lives matter, right? One of the two as retorts, and both of them are frustrating, right? The black on black violence is frustrating because, number one, it's a distraction from the conversation, right, obviously. But number one, in most black communities, even if there is a higher level of violence, those are things that are being responded to in their communities, right? I know in my community in Harrisburg, we got people who doing all kinds of campaigns around gun violence and all that stuff. And so to think that black people aren't aware of challenges in their own communities is silly. But on the other hand, like, it's not the same thing as state violence, state-sanctioned violence, and the permissibility of that in communities is a whole nother level of issues that needs to be responded to. And the reality is that even further than that is that most violence and crime in our country is racialized. So the majority of white crime is against white people, right? It's that most of our crime is racialized because we live in racially segregated communities, right? And so even just acknowledging that basic reality is sometimes ignored. Why is there so much black on black crime? Because our society was controlled and dominated by white people, organized society in such a way in which black people were concentrated into these communities and not given access. That's why there's black and black crime, right? And so I think like those kind of things are frustrating to hear people say those things and I think that it doesn't seem like they're genuinely caring about black life. It's just to try to retort, to try to shut down the conversation. Same thing with all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter. Everybody, that's not the issue, is not whether all lives matter or not. The issue is that black people are disproportionately being killed, which shows that in this country, black lives are not mattering, which means that all lives are not mattering, right? And so it's a distraction again, away from the actual concern. It's like, I think I heard somebody say once, if your wife asks you, do you love me? You're not gonna say, I love all God's creatures, right? No, that's not an acceptable answer, right? You might not be allowed back in the house afterwards. And so we have to separate the universal from the particular. And sometimes if we can't affirm the particular, then we're demonstrating that the universal principle has no bearing. It's very easy to make universal statements, right? Now this is not a true universal statement, but all men are created equal, right? There's some patriarchy there already, but all men are created equal, right? This idea, meanwhile, Jefferson, who wrote that, got slaves, right? And so you can live in that contradiction of just this umbrella of a universal statement, but until it gets manifested and fleshed out in the particular, it really means nothing.
Mm-hmm. There's a question online, I'm seeing.
Yeah, so actually, I think it might lead well out of kind of what you were just getting at, but I think language is really important in the way we talk about this, because I think it's too easy to have our political talking points and not actually get to any meat of conversation. So how can changing the language that we use help, and what language have you found maybe to be helpful in actually being able to break down barriers to have good conversation and actually get somewhere?
Yeah, no, I think language is huge, and I think because I'm aware of like the way that people respond to particular words, sometimes I'll just use different words at least to start, right? So like, I'll use an example. So we started off with racial hierarchy, and then we were talking about white supremacy, and I connected and said that it's the same thing, right? I joke sometimes, I say like, I use racialized for all kinds of things. It means the exact same. So if I say that was racialized, that's like almost like saying it was racist, right? But if I say that was racist, people will get very defensive. I can say the exact same thing. It means the exact same thing, right? But the word itself is not as, for white communities, they're socialized to respond very defensively, I think, around the word racist. And so that can kind of just end conversation. And so you can't even begin to explain what you mean when you say that, because it's already shut down. And so I think word choice can at least open up opportunities for having conversations. But I do think that it's also important for, my challenge would be is that for those who participate in white dominant culture to also take ownership for how you respond to these conversations. Because it's not on everybody can't be sitting around all day thinking of new ways to phrase things so that you don't get offended, right? And so I think people also so sociologists and psychologists have talked about the term white fragility, which is a language to describe how, because many white people are socialized in a way where they don't talk about race and racism very often in their societies, in their communities, in their families. The defensiveness comes really quick, shut down, emotional, disengage, right? And so my challenge is always that you got to take ownership for how you're responding in these conversations, right? Yes, it's great for us, for any of us who are engaging in these conversations, to use different terms to try to open up conversation, but ultimately people have to take ownership of how they're going to respond. Not that you still might get uncomfortable, but you can decide that you're going to stay in the conversation, right? That's really all that we need from people, is that everyone's committed to staying in the conversation, open dialogue. That means back and forth, two ways, conversation and dialogue.
Staying engaged.
Staying engaged.
Right. Sir, did I see a hand raised over here? Yeah, we have a couple of them. Do we have the microphone?
I've raised a couple children in Rochester, and our schools are by and large rather diverse, and many of our large corporations and companies are, but what advice do you have for churches? Because our churches by and large are not very diverse, and we don't even know how to begin to approach that.
Yeah, our churches. Well, let me start by saying this. The first question, so often our first question is, how do we become more diverse? And maybe that's not even the right starting point, right? Maybe the question for us ought to be is, how do we take ownership over, one, the church's history, in terms of, like, we're just not honest. Like, the church played a central role in theologizing and making biblical arguments for manifest destiny, for slavery, for Jim Crow, like all hard intellectual work. Presidents of colleges were hard at work writing arguments, theological arguments in support of a white supremacist society, right? And so we need to take ownership over the distortions to Christianity itself that that happened in this land, right? I mean, I like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass says there is true Christianity and Christianity of this land, right? And to love the one is to be an enemy of the other. That's what he says, right? Well, I think we have to acknowledge that Christianity has been manipulated and used to endorse all kinds of stuff and kind of work through our own stuff. Because I think we've kind of dealt with the surface stuff, but we haven't asked we think white Jesus is not really a problem, and at most, even if we do think it's a problem, it's a visual problem, but not a theological problem of how we understand Jesus as identifying with people in the world, those who are most vulnerable, right? What happens when a poor Jew living under Roman occupation begins to identify and represent those in dominance, right? That's a theological problem. It's not just a visual problem, right? And so I think that there's some real deep questions, that's just to begin with, that I think needs to be explored. And I think then, I think churches have great opportunities to explore their story and the story of the communities that they participate in, right? What's the story of that land and space in which the church inhabits, right? I like to go all the way back. Whose land was it originally? Like, who were the original indigenous communities that lived there? What happened to them? Where did they get displaced, right? Tell that story. Going forward, who was welcomed into that space, right? Different states and regions were welcoming some people into some regions and not welcoming other folks, right? So what was going on? Even locally, sundown towns and all kinds of stuff were going on. And so what's that story of that space that the church inhabits? Because if it can't tell that story, how's it going to live faithfully into something new, right? We got to know where we've come from if we're going to live into something more faithful moving forward. And so I think that there's great opportunity for the church to tell an alternative story, right? A story that comes from below, from the voices of those that have suffered most in our society or have been excluded and ignored. And I think that if we begin to do that, I think it will become more and more obvious how we ought to move forward, right? And it's not going to be the same thing. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for all churches. But in light of that history, I think it can give us some real serious roadmaps. So that means churches need to be doing some real historical work in terms of understanding both historical memory, but also just the region. Where are we situated, and what's that story? And being honest about it. But then also collectively, right? Like sometimes I'll say, an all-white church, even in an all-white neighborhood, some people are like, well, what do we do? We're all white. I'm like, you're at the center of the action. That's it. That's where real work needs to be happening. You don't need to be in a racially diverse community to start challenging and confronting and paying attention to white supremacy and how it shapes one's own life, right? And so I think that those are good starting points. Even before we make the, it's too quick, like we can jump to being a racially diverse community and still ignore some of those deeper questions that really have a lot to do with the faithfulness of how we live in society as the church.
Thank you. There's an online question.
Yeah, so actually it's just a comment that I think is really powerful, and so I'm just going to see kind of how you might react to it and what you might have to say about it. But a guy named Steve says, when I was an inner city pastor in Kansas City, I heard some Southern Baptist denominational executives excitedly tell us about their plan to penetrate our neighborhood with the gospel. After shaking with anger, I bore my witness that the gospel had been in our neighborhood long before I had arrived.
Yeah, I mean, that goes along with my story about the invasion, right? Harrisburg invasion. But when you see yourself, I mean, so whiteness, as much as it's a sociological category, it's a theological category too. It has deep, I mean, you go back to its development. White supremacy develops out of Western Christendom, right? And if we can't acknowledge that then we miss the theological implications. So some people imagine themselves sometimes with good intentions, but imagine themselves to be closer to God and to be bringing God with them wherever they go, right? And for other people to be godless, to be lacking, right? We talk the dark continents, right? That language, there's a way of perceiving other communities as some being more pathological and sinful and others being the kind of standard, the divine standard from which everybody else ought to assimilate and live into. And so when we imagine our communities like that, then it's not going to be surprising that people are going to imagine themselves as penetrating these evil, dark spaces rather than being able to see that God has been at work. And maybe, could it just be that Paul was right, that God has chosen those that have been deemed as nothing to shame those who see themselves as something, right? That it's the wisdom of Christ crucified that shows that God has always been most at work, most powerfully at work among those who are most vulnerable and marginalized and oppressed in our society.
I think I saw a question in the second row. Oh, you got a mic already. Good.
I'm a Sudanese American, and for me, race issues has been very gray, race issues in America, because of my historical trauma. I left Sudan when things were very ugly for me, to the point my religious leader was executed in public. So we had to leave the country. When we left to the United Arab Emirates, also we faced like a different kind of racism. So when we came to America, we felt relieved. And my experience in America was in Iowa City, in Iowa, where I worked in the same institution for so many years. And all my supervisors were Caucasian, and many of my coworkers were Caucasian. And I didn't know a lot about race issues. When my kids and myself discuss issues, I felt like my kids were so bitter many times, and I was so surprised. Yeah. And I started to learn about the race issues. So I know there is chronic issues need to be fixed, but I'm not sure where is the most work need to focus where, like for Caucasians who are really want to see changes, and for African Americans who are like scholars and activists, where is the most work need to be done, like amendment to the Constitution, or like public policies, or social work? Where is the most work need to be done?
I just want to be like, yes to all of that. Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, that's a huge question. And let me add, so my mom is from Jamaica. So my dad's from Philly, my mom is from Jamaica. She moved when she was 19. And I remember her coming up sometimes saying that she didn't fully understand American racism, at least early on. Now if you ask her, she wouldn't say it anymore. And I think it was seeing her own kids' experiences, right? The challenges that we face, I think, clarified for her. Because growing up in Jamaica, sometimes, I think that sometimes people can cling to black folk from other countries, and that everyone's coming from different contexts, right? And so while there's always some kind of form of social dominance happening, it's not necessarily the exact same as what's happening here, right? And so people need to begin to understand, the dynamics that are local here. But to your question, where's the work? It because it shapes all areas of our lives. I really do mean yes, right? That all of intellectual work needs to be confronted. Cultural productions, public. But for me, I guess my thing is the church, right? That the church ought to be a place where not only are we able to talk about race and racism, but that we ought to be a part of the solution and transformation in society, right? That's what I really care deeply about. But I think that the work is much broader than just the church needing to do that work. And I think that the church can do it in a whole variety of ways. I got the opportunity to spend some time with Brian Stevenson, who does, he's with the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. Does death penalty, mass incarceration, whole variety of stuff. One of the things I was amazed, because going down, I think there's a bunch of lawyers, right? So let me see some of the cases that they're doing. I got there and I was amazed that they didn't stay in their lane, right? They were creating this museum on the 3rd floor to tell the story from slavery up to the present day. They had this wall where they had literally collected the dirt from all the lynching sites that have been recorded in Alabama. It was just filled up the whole entire wall. You can see all the different colors and has the names of the people. Documentaries, all kinds of stuff. He kept saying, we're trying to change the story, right? And so the narrative, trying to change the narrative, right? Helping people, because I think people are socialized in a way of thinking about America that's dishonest, right? That doesn't take into account that the majority of our country has been slavery and genocide of Native Americans, right? Like that's the majority of our time, right? 400 years, 1619 to the present, 250 years of that is slavery, right? It doesn't take into account the stealing of the lands from Mexico, right, from Mexicans, which is all kinds of irony with the kind of conversations we have today. It doesn't take into consideration, Japanese internment camps and just the widespread white supremacy that shaped so many different people in our country. And so I think that we do need to refuse to stay in our lane, that's kind of my takeaway from Brian Stevenson and to just think broadly, dream big, and dare to just each of us to do our part to kind of respond and resist these forces that are working in our society that are, in many ways, it dehumanizes all of us, right? None of us are better off with a world like this. All of us are more human and can do life together more genuinely when we dismantle and disrupt white supremacy.
The side of the room's just been so quiet. All right, we have one over here.
So as I've been doing reading and research on racism in America, one of the things that has struck me is the lack of kind of that cultural memory that you've talked about that white Americans don't have. That is so present in the lives of people of color. And I think you started to speak to this a little bit in one of your responses, but have you found ways to kind of create that for white people to educate them on what that is and then our part in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a few different ways to go at that, but let's see. One of it is just simply being honest intergenerationally. Right? I think intergeneration, it seems like every generation, mostly, right? Not every single white family, but most white families seems like start from scratch, right? where they know nothing of the racial challenges and issues that come before them, nonetheless several generations. And so there's a lack of honesty and conversation around those racial realities intergenerationally. And I think some of it is this idea that people want to protect their children from the world, but really, if anything, it's just giving them over to the socializing patterns of the society. Like, that's not, and so I think thinking like, what kind of children do you want to have, right? Ones that are sensitive and aware of the history and then can respond and are more likely then to be able to resist these socializing patterns, or to just let them go along by the socializing patterns of our society. So that's one thing, is just the intergenerational conversation that needs to happen. But I think that, and this, I would say this to any dominant group in the world, so this is not just about white people, right? I think that it's very easy for any dominant group to kind of live into its own narratives, how it likes to spin its own story, right? And so I think that in any dominant group, and in this case for white people, there needs to be particular intentionality in hearing the stories of those who've been vulnerable and oppressed in society. Who are those historically oppressed communities, and how do we reach out and intentionally allow those stories to shape our story, right? And retell our story in light of those stories. And so, some of this just is education. So like my kids, they know that slavery happened, and they know about Jim Crow, and we read children's stories, stuff that's geared towards their age, right? But that helps them understand what has gone on in the world. And I think that that's not something that's just a choice that black families or people of color in general should be making. It's something that all families, right, anybody that lives in this country, that this is a part of our story now. And how do we make sense of those things? And so intentionally introducing that literature and those stories. And then there's just so many opportunities for, the museums and stuff that exists, right? It's not because there's a lack of resources. It's just that people are not valuing those things for themselves and their families and their communities. And so I think really valuing and saying that this is important. We're going to make this a priority, right? We're going to get to DC and see this new African American museum, right? Because this is important for us to understand our place in society. We need to also reframe and retell our own narratives in light of those stories that are being suppressed.
I can't believe the way the time has gone. I want to ask I have one last question I want to ask, but I want to go last. So I don't know if there's anything online or in-house. It looks like
Yeah, I think we've got one over here. So I think there are a lot of different conversations in our society where we're maybe missing how the dominant culture has kind of set up a framework, whether it's socioeconomics or whether it's sexual identity or any number of places where we've kind of said this is the norm, right? Should those conversations sort of find each other as we have that conversation, or do those need to be separated? And what's the best way to handle maybe the similarities or differences in some of those challenges that we face?
Yeah, I don't think we can't keep them completely separate and think that we're like, if they always remain separate, we're kind of not getting to the heart of the root of the issue, right? At some point, you've got to see how these things overlap and intertwine and feed into each other. That's why, I can't talk about white supremacy and not talk about patriarchy, right? It doesn't make sense. There's times where I might focus on one or the other, but at some point I gotta be able to deal with both and how those things overlap in really significant ways and how they're complicated, right? In that kind of intertwining. It doesn't necessarily mean that, I know some folks, and I probably would disagree with them, who say you always have to be dealing with the overlaps. I don't know if that's always possible or realistic, because we're all on journeys. But I think as a part of that, it has to become a part of that conversation, and it has to expand broader. As our frameworks are broadened, we have to then expand beyond that as well. But it's not, we're not dealing with people's real lived experiences if we're only dealing with one thing, right? Because nobody is just one-dimensional, right? We all have many facets to us and many different identities and experiences. And if we're going to be true to ourselves, I mean, you think about your own story, right? It's complicated. It's a whole bunch of stuff, right? And so the more that we can begin to tell us, so that's why one thing I tell people, like, you know, I'm a black man in America, but I also got a PhD now, right? So I live with that tension, right? I know I can hop out in the car and nobody will see that PhD, but I also have access at different times, and I've got to deal with all of that and think about what that means, right? Because education provides access that other things don't, right? And so our lives are complicated. I know my experience is much different than my brother's experience, right? The way that I can live and move in society, the opportunities that I have are not the same as my brother's. And so being honest and dealing with those complexities are important, yeah.
We have questions all over the place, but we do have a time frame, so I'm going to encourage, if you're in-house, make sure to connect with Drew afterwards. You'll be around for a little while, and but we have to kind of wrap it up with one last question. And it's a question that was raised for me as it's toward the end of the book. You wrote something that is beautiful, a beautiful sentence. I want to quote you to yourself. You said, I have been persuaded that the church's power is different from our society's power, and it is released by God at the axis of human vulnerability. It's released by God at the axis of human vulnerability. So I just want to ask, when have you seen this power unleashed, and where have you seen transformation taking place?
Well, I mean, so I guess it would be important to just say, to start out, like, we imagine that, you know, the world moves from, you know, those who are in power, right? So especially in our society, because we have a democracy, you know, those who are elected in power, or those who are the CEOs and those who are wealthy and in government positions. That's what, you know, that's how people tell history, right? From, you know, Rome, we tell history by who was emperor, right? And so we kind of look up and think that that's where all the action is that we got to pay attention to. But what we see both in the biblical narrative from the beginning all the way through the end is this idea that it's, you know, getting into 300, right? It's David, it's these enslaved Israelites that God is freeing, right? It's Jesus, a poor Jew living under Roman occupation, right? It's these stories of vulnerability in those who are oppressed and those who are discounted and denied and rejected in society that God is actually working through. And so in our society, I'd say the same thing, right? That when we've seen great transformation in American society, it's not been like sometimes we pay so much attention to those at the top that we miss that on the ground it was actually these movements from below, right? Not top-down power, but bottom-up, grassroots people, particularly marginalized people who've been leading us into transforming our society in really meaningful ways. Certainly, I mean, I think civil rights movement is a great example of that, right? It's not just Martin Luther King, who in many ways, he's picked as a part of a movement that's already happening, right? He's just the face of this movement of people on the ground who dreamed that another world was possible, right? You see those churches filled with women, right, who are showing up and who believe and praying and marching and walking. You have SNCC college students, right, showing up in masses. You got Birmingham's children, right, that shut down the whole entire city, right? And so there's ways in which God has, even in our own society, we've gotten to see the ways that people are kind of being pulled from the corners, cracks, and edges of society. I think same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement today. You see that happening. And I think it's a testament to that God is at work and that God doesn't necessarily work the way that we think things should work in terms of change, right? The change isn't, the real significant transformational change isn't top down, it's bottom up. And then sometimes it's the bottom up that puts pressure on the top to align with what is happening in that particular moment.
Thank you so much, Drew. Yep. Let's thank Drew. Just a few closing thoughts. To learn more about Drew and what he's up to, you can check him out on Twitter, and go to his website, drewgihart.com, and you can follow and participate in his work. Video of tonight's conversations, as well as other sessions that we've had here in the Sandbox, they're available online. We'll have discussion questions so you can talk about it with your friends, with your family, small groups as you go. We have some exciting plans happening for Sandbox Cooperative. We're working on new sessions to come in the next school year, 2017, 2018. But then also, we're leaving a week from tomorrow on a road trip to collect interviews for our podcast. So a word about our podcast. Comes out twice a month, and you can subscribe to that on iTunes or Google Play, or again, wherever you do your podcasty type things. But if you're not into podcasts, you should be, and check it out. And again, it's about exploring life, faith, and curiosity. We're working hard to build a community of people just like what we're having tonight. And Sandbox community always works better when you're a part of it. So make sure that you follow us on Facebook and Twitter, that you subscribe to our email you can do that through our website, and check us out at sandboxcooperative.com. Again, Sandbox Cooperative is completely funded through donations and financial gifts, grants that we get. So if you're in-house, we've got a hat over there if you'd like to leave a financial donation. If you're watching online, hi. And we'd love it if you would make a donation, and you can hit the donate tab on our website. And thank you for your generosity. So please share the good word about what we're doing. Please share the good word about what Drew is up to. Check out his book, again, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Drew Hart.